good evening. Today is February 16th, 2022. My name is Ted Landsmark. I am a professor of public policy within the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University. I'm also the faculty member of record for the Open Classroom, which you are signed in to participate in. Let me just say a word about this semester's offering. Over the last few semesters, we've covered a number of issues concerning race and class and ways in which universities can inform students and staff and faculty, and importantly, the communities within which we exist. And we've talked about community engagement in a variety of ways. And we realize that over the course of these conversations, there are times when universities and university personnel engage effectively with the communities we serve. And then there are times when we don't. And often the difference between the one and the other is that we haven't really thought through and engaged in ways that are fundamentally ethical and non-exploitive. Universities in particular do lots and lots of research in communities. And we often do that research in ways that are beneficial to the researchers and to the universities. But we don't always assess the ways in which that research and that service is necessarily empowering and beneficial to the communities themselves. So a few of us thought that maybe it's time for us to take a hard look at the way we engage with communities. And I say this in particular in this post-George Floyd era, where lots of cultural institutions, lots of city agencies, lots of universities, lots of nonprofit organizations have taken it on ourselves to engage more actively in communities. And as we've done that, one of the things we're observing is that very often we can do it better. And so this semester, we're going to focus on many of the issues and opportunities that exist around ethical community engagement. And we're a little different than we've been in all of our other semesters in that we're assuring that those panelists that we present to you and the dialogue that we enter into engages more than university faculty and university staff, and also engages people from the communities themselves. We're co-creating something here, and we're looking for your active engagement in this process. I will note that all of these sessions are being recorded. We have question and answer boxes and chat boxes, and we do want the participants to listen to the panelists and then jump in with questions and comments and critiques of what is being said. And with that, I am going to turn the screen and the session over to my colleague, Rebecca Riccio. And then I'm actually going to duck out briefly to attend a community meeting where a well-known university is presenting some of its plans to an adjacent community, and then I'll be back. So Rebecca, you're on.
Thank you so much, Ted. I am so excited to be co-facilitating this semester's open classroom with you again. It is always a joy to learn from and with you. And I think the journey of this semester is really important as an opportunity for us to model what it means to bring our journeys toward anti-racism and anti-oppression that I hope at this point all of us are on, what it means to bring that work into all facets of our work. including the way in which we do community engaged teaching and research. As a lifelong social change practitioner, educator, and activist, I really do think that the last 2 years call upon us to engage in a deep reckoning with everything we thought we understood about how social change and community engagement happen. And whether that work is being practiced in higher education or the nonprofit sector and philanthropy, in offices of corporate social responsibility, or in public agencies, we need to look at an unsettling reality, which is that in many of those settings, when you look at who controls the resources, the agenda, the power to set priorities of which social challenges we're going to address and where and what's going to get the investment, those folks often do not look like the people in the very communities that are bearing the heaviest burden of those social challenges. And no matter how good one's intentions might be, that inherent power dynamic means that there is a risk of unintended harm when folks go into someone else's lives and someone else's community with the intention to do good or cause change. That lack of perspective, that lack of shared lived experience can actually become a ticket to perpetuating inequity and creating harm. As I said, even when intentions are good. I want to own that as a white woman of privilege who began my career in the social change arena 30 years ago with a very earnest commitment to changing the world, including in communities not my own. I'm aware of my own complicity in the system I just described, and in the inequity and oppressiveness of a world that I have worked in for decades. And that is why I am so grateful to work with people like those who are gathered here tonight, who recognize that we all need to be doing better, and we need to be identifying these issues in community and in conversation with each other. And so tonight we're going to kick off this semester of showcasing community engaged work with a conversation of what it means to do that work ethically. And we're going to look at an anti-oppressive framework for community engagement that a number of us at Northeastern have been working on together. Before I do that, though, I'd like to welcome and thank our guests and invite each of you to give a quick overview of your work now, just so everyone in the audience has a sense of who we are and why we found ourselves together today. And then we'll learn more about your work in the course of the conversation that is going to follow a brief presentation of our principles of anti-oppressive community engagement. So let's unpin me for just a second, if we could, and look at all of our faces together and go around one at a time, introduce ourselves and where you work in a brief description of what you're doing. And I think that I'll start because I think we might be waiting for one more of our panelists to join us. So I'm going to start with the team that's here from Millennium Campus Network and welcome Sam Vagar, the executive director and a longtime thought partner in the work of social change. Sam, welcome.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's wonderful to be with you and with Director Landsmark and all of you at Northeastern and in the community. I first want to thank you for bringing us together. And I also actually wanted to acknowledge the leader whose name is on this program, the Myra Kraft Open Classroom. I don't think I've shared this with you, Rebecca, but Myra is actually one of the first leaders who believed in me and in us when I was an undergraduate at Brandeis. She was a trustee there who really centered students and enabled us to launch Millennium Campus Network. And so it's really meaningful to be in this space with all of you. And at Brandeis 15 years ago, I co-founded Millennium Campus Network, MCN, as a platform for undergraduates making a difference. And today, through our Millennium Fellowship, we provide training, connections, and credentials to undergraduates making a difference. And really what we ask of Millennium Fellows is to center empathy, humility, and inclusion in the work that they're doing in communities. There are active Millennium Fellowship cohorts at Northeastern and at 136 universities across the United States and in 30 nations. And I'm really grateful that two Millennium Fellows, Katarina and Mariana, are joining us live from Sao Paulo in Brazil tonight to share their own work with Colors of Care and their perspectives. So I'll turn it over to them to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Sam, Mariana. Katarina, please tell us a little bit about your work.
Sure. Good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Mariana Torquato. I'm from São Paulo, Brazil. I'm a last year medical student here at Faculdade Israelita de Ciências da Saúde, Albert Einstein, really long name. But I'm also a fellow, so from the MCN Millennium Fellowship. And along with Katarina, my partner, we had a project that is named Colors of Care. And we can talk a little bit about this with you guys in a little bit.
Great. Katarina.
Hi, everyone. Oh, thank you, Rebecca. Just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Katarina Valada. I'm a 5th year medical student and from the same faculdade as Mariana. And I think we're gonna share briefly about our project later, but just wanted to thank for the opportunity to be here and say hello.
Oh, we're so grateful that you're bringing a perspective that's not around the corner from campus, but will allow us to shine a completely different international perspective on the conversation tonight. But I'm also really happy that we do have two folks with us who have a very local perspective on this work and what it looks like for Northeastern to be engaged with communities in Boston. And so, Lisa, I'm going to hand it over to you next.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Dr. Landsmark and all of our fellow panelists. I'm so honored and excited to be with you this evening and to have a chance to participate in such a wonderful conversation. Again, my name is Lisa Laguerre, and I'm the Associate Director of Community Relations for the Institute on Race and Justice here at Northeastern. For those that are not familiar with the Institute, we are housed in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and we are a social justice research institute that looks at how race influences how policies are formed in criminal justice institutions and how these policies impact urban communities. The way that we conduct our research, which is slightly unique from other institutions looking at the same type of inquiries, is that we try to use a community-based participatory research approach, where we believe that if you combine the expertise of social scientists and academics who are researching these issues, along with the expertise of community practitioners that are working on these important issues at the ground level, that it helps us to produce better informed research that can hopefully be used to advance the cause of social justice and ultimately influence pushing the needle on some level of policy and reform. With that being said, and under the direction of Dr. Jack McDevitt, who is not with us this evening, but he's the director of the Institute on Race and Justice, we've been very fortunate to have an ongoing and longstanding relationship with members of our local community advisory board who voluntarily meet with us on a regular basis and really help us put this community-based partnership approach into practice. Utilizing this model, we've been successful in influencing some level of policy and reform on issues of hate crimes, human trafficking, racial profiling, citizen oversight, and civilian review. So I'm very pleased and happy to have joining me tonight Mr. Sam Williams, who is the co-director of our Community Advisory Board for the Institute on Race and Justice. And so I will turn it over to Sam now to you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, panelists and hosts and moderators. My name is Sam Williams. I'm Boston bred, graduated through the Boston public school system and that whole cycle. I'm currently the executive director for an agency in Concord, Mass. Called the Concord Prison Outreach. I've been doing prison reentry, prison reform, social justice for the last 25 years in Boston and across the state of Massachusetts. But about 18 years ago, at least about 18 years ago, Lisa approached me and asked me if I would be interested in being involved in this community advisory board. My first response was no, because of my understanding and experience with institutions of learning, and other institutions. And I wasn't going to set the community up to be used as a laboratory. And I said, unless there's some integrity, character, and we can be accountable for the work that we do, I didn't want to bring myself and community involved. And that was 18 years ago. And within that time, as Lisa said, we've been doing some amazing work. And I'll just stop there and we can talk more whenever that space opens up again.
Thank you so much to all of you for being here. And Sam, you just framed the issue so perfectly from your lived experience of it. There is such risk of these relationships being transactional and extractive and harmful to the communities that they are intended to benefit. So I really do hope that we can dive into that deeply. I am going to share the principles of anti-oppressive community engagement that we're hoping will start a conversation about how to do this work together. But before I do that, I want to just provide a little bit of context about where they came from. I have been deeply fortunate over the last many years to be a part of a community at Northeastern University, very diverse community of faculty and staff and students who share a commitment to doing this work through the lenses of racial and social justice. And we have been sharing ideas and best practice and supporting each other in this work for a long time. Throughout the pandemic, three of us, in addition to myself, Becca Berkey and Jordana McCagney, decided that we wanted to make a commitment to documenting, to articulating the principles that held this community together. And to do that as a way to hold ourselves accountable for making sure that we are putting into action the wisdom that we have learned in community with many BIPOC and queer colleagues, and from scholars who really have thoroughly invested themselves in learning about these issues and suggesting ways in which we can continue together to do the work better. Once we made that commitment, it became clear to us that a lot of voices need to be a part of the process. And so I want to thank a few of those voices, students who have been working in the Social Impact Lab throughout this process, Chantel Hagler and Anna Denise, who have given us an incredibly valuable student's perspective on this work, as well as Tess Caldwell, who handled all the technology for us in terms of getting them out and shared with the public. Without that team, we would not have been able to make as much progress as we have on them. Also, we want to acknowledge that we are not sharing them because we think we have this all figured out. We're sharing them as an offering and as an invitation to say, okay, this is a beginning. This is what we have been learning from and with our colleagues in this space. This is what we are reading about from scholars who are deeply invested in it. This is our experience from having been engaged for decades, some of us, in community engaged work, and seeing mistakes that have been made, seeing when it's done well. And so as part of the process, we have continued to workshop the principles, and this version represents a lot of thoughtful and caring input and feedback from a large number of folks of all identities, of all ages, and a wide range of experiences in this work. And I am so deeply grateful to them. With that, I am going to actually share what these principles are. So let me transition to sharing my screen and bringing those up. And what I'm going to do is to put them all out at once. Let me just expand this view. All right. When we sat down to think about capturing this learning in a way that could be actionable, right? Because without the ability to put these into action and hold ourselves accountable, they could just become more lovely but performative and shallow language, which often does more harm than when nothing is said at all. And so we captured these 10 ideas about what those of us who are deeply committed to anti-oppressive community engagement should be keeping in our hearts and in our minds as we do this work. That we will honor communities' autonomy and right to self-determination. That we will respect their history, culture, lived experience, and expertise. That we'll recognize the limits of our own lived experience, expertise, and perspectives. That will reflect on our social identities, positions in power, build authentic, mutually beneficial relationships with patience and humility. We'll manage resources equitably, hold ourselves accountable, rethink our relationship with time and urgency, recognize that ethical community engagement begins with our students in our classrooms, and finally, to prioritize patience, perspective taking, and joy. We understood that it was important to communicate those broad ideas in language that was as jargon-free as possible, and that speaks to this notion of reclaiming our shared humanity. But we also understood that those big ideas, everyone can sign on to them, but that doesn't mean that they'll have any sense of how to take them into communities, into our lives, how we will use them to change how we act and how we think about the world that we're doing our community engagement in. And so under each of the big ideas, we went into a little bit more detail, and I don't want to take the time to go into those for every single one, but I'll put up a QR code in just a minute and we'll drop into the chat the link to the principles. And I encourage you all to explore them. And perhaps if it would help you to follow along with the conversation, you can take a look at them while we're talking. But just to give you a couple ideas of what we're trying to do, I'll go into the detailed notes on a couple of them. So under the first one, honoring communities' autonomy and right to self-determination, what does that actually mean? It means that we will acknowledge when we're visitors in other people's communities and respect their autonomy, agency, and right to make their own decisions about matters affecting their lives and futures. And we'll respect that communities have the right to define the challenges and opportunities they face, set the priorities that will allow them to thrive, and define success on their own terms. So Sam, when you expressed your reluctance to accept the invitation to the Institute for Race and Justice, I heard that. And this is this first principle is trying to make sure that we're not being exploitative and extractive. There are principles here, though, that are not just about what we need to do in relation to others, but what we need to do within ourselves, because this work really must begin with a reckoning with our own racialized and socialized identities and our positionality in the world, and how we choose to show up for other human beings based on a reckoning of who we have understood ourselves to be and where we can do this work better. And so number 3 is recognizing the limits of our lived experience, expertise, and perspectives, meaning that we'll acknowledge that we're not the first or only people to problem solve in the communities we engage with, that we have to educate ourselves about individuals in the community and in other disciplines and fields who already address the challenges and opportunities we're working on, and that we'll question the frameworks and narratives and assumptions that have shaped our understanding of the world and the disciplines and fields in which we work, because we have all been incubated in this oppressive system that creates the inequities and the disparities that we're trying to address. But if we don't understand the extent to which our mindsets, our mental models have been shaped by that system, we're not going to be able to disrupt them. And then another one that's really important, I think, is to recognize that ethical community engagement begins with our students, which means that if we can't do this work in the first degree of separation we have with human beings who are not only doing the work of community engagement, but are from and of the communities we're working with, we're not ever going to be able to do it outside the classroom walls. And so we will respect the diverse identities and lived experiences of our students and recognize the harm that can occur in classrooms and labs because of unconscious bias and the power imbalance among instructors and students. And we'll give deference to students' experience of racial and social injustice and relationships with the issues and communities we are addressing. And we'll study and practice anti-racist and trauma-informed pedagogy to minimize the risk of such harms. Here's a QR code that you can use to link to the principles. There's also a bit.ly there, SIL ethical engagement, and there will be a link dropped in the chat. I include I love all of the principles, but this one, prioritize patience, perspective taking, and joy. I always want to emphasize, because we know this work is aspirational. I will be the first to admit that my lab is not able to live all of these 10 principles yet. I am not able to, none of us are. They are aspirational. And the point of aspirations is to name where we're trying to go so that we can identify what it takes to get there and then hold ourselves accountable. And this work is hard. It means reimagining ourselves in the world. It means reimagining the work that we do. And so patience with ourselves and with each other is essential. Perspective taking so that we can keep remembering why we're doing this with each other and what it means to be trying to understand how we and each others show up in the world, and the joy that comes from doing that work in community. It's what keeps us going. It's part of the self-care that allows us to confront the reality of living in oppressive systems as we try, in fact, to dismantle them and bring about change for the better. I also want to acknowledge something great that's happening on campus this week. It is a visit from Dr. Tania Mitchell, who is going to be our publicly engaged scholar in residence, who will lead us through a process in which we're actually trying to develop an accountability toolkit. That is to say, how do we go even further from the principles at their broadest level to that small print, which says what it looks like, to concrete action items that we can identify in collaboration with our community partners and negotiate as an agreement to what this will look like, so that we can actually, in a co-creative way, come up with agreements that are transparent and will allow us to engage in continual learning and improving together. With that, I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to stop talking, because what's really important here is to contextualize these ideas in the work as it's happening on the ground. And I think we're going to unpin me so that we're all communicating here together. And I think Sam, I'm going to ask you, Sam W, not Sam V. I'll have to make sure I'm clear about which Sam I'm talking about. Sam, you gave such a really clear indication of your experience and your concerns about what uninformed community engagement, what harmful community engagement can look like. Can you just talk a little bit more from your perspective about why we need to be talking and thinking about this stuff? Oh, you are still muted, Sam.
As Rebecca, as you was talking, one of the things, I have a couple of points, but I'll just focus on this one. This term around kind of intentionality and what I would call soft handoffs, right? And what I mean is that, like, what normally happens with institutions, smaller lives that work with community, it on the front end, it starts as almost like a dependency model, right? So the community is depending on this institution, normally because they're bringing resources into the community. They agree to collaborate because the community think, well, at the end of the day, we might get something from it, right? Mm-hmm. And what happens is that even if there's something that's produced that is benefit to the institution and the community, when the community leaves, there's no empowerment or infrastructure set up where that work, if it's a benefit for the community is empowered to be able to carry it on themselves. So no infrastructure was never built. And so that's what I meant by the intentionality and the soft handoff. I think what I would suggest is those partnerships on the front end, there be a clear assessment done of what the needs are, what the reciprocity and the experience are going to be. And if this is really a partnership, the institution will assure that going into that partnership, there is a plan to pass off support and at least have some type of a runway for community project, community agency to be able to sustain that work beyond that particular partnership. So that was one thing that came to my mind. I've seen it done hundreds of times. Large funds of money come into the community, and at the end of the day, people walk away and communities still struggling with the same issues that was funded. That's my Apple phone. Sorry, my phone.
Your phone's agreeing with you.
But yeah, I'll stop there. But so that was the assessment on the front end, pass off, intentionality. How do you empower the community to be able to sustain the work independent of the institution?
Yeah. Sam, before we have somebody else jump in, because Lisa, I would love for you to come in and tell us what that's looked like in IRJ. But I'm wondering, Sam, when does that have to start? Right? When does that communication, that relationship building have to start in order for it to be authentic?
I would say 18 years ago when Lisa met me, we haven't done that. We've done some amazing things, but we haven't done what I described, right? So we're not a model that can say, and I'll be honest to say it to Jack, and we haven't done that, but we've done amazing things. We've done statewide stuff, but it would have to have happened at the beginning. It has to be that vision, that collaborative vision, and the commitment to put those things in place on the front end.
Lisa, let's hear from you about all that.
Yes, just thinking about, listening to Sam reflect on when we first had our initial conversations, and it just brings me back, like he said, going on 18 plus years ago. And I think what we wanted to do in terms of beginning this institute was try to figure out a way that the institute could engage with the community that would be a model that would be both beneficial to the institute as well as to the community and community members that agreed to be involved. So the way that we began that was by having a series of interviews and conversations. So going to the community, Sam was amongst one of my first meetings, going to the first of hundreds of meetings, going to the community, explaining this concept of what the Institute on Race and Justice is thought to be, and how would you like to see the Institute on Race and Justice partner and be a valuable resource to the community in the work and servicing the population that you serve. So in those conversations, we got an understanding of, well, first you have to be willing to listen and own the historical legacy of the negative relationships and the exploitative nature that usually transpires between academic institutions and communities. Regardless, I am a woman of color, but I still represent Northeastern University. And so being in the community, there's a certain level of trust that I need to regain now that's passed off just from that historical context. I think it was a lot of conversations with people like Sam being a little disgruntled, saying, well, what is this going to be? The same, more of the same of what we've experienced in the past. I think really listening to what the community members wanted to have happen, to really listen to how they wanted to see this partnership come about, and really listen to what some of the small mutual benefits could begin to look like. So what I would say, as Sam said, we're talking 18 years later. I think part of that is because the concept of having a community advisory board came from as a recommendation of those conversations. So it wasn't that I went out to the community and said, well, this is what we're doing. We have this institute in place. These are the projects we're working on. And this is the role that we want for you to play. We're putting together a community advisory board, and would you join us? It was more of asking and approaching and then following up on the suggestions that came about. And that's how the community advisory board came into existence.
Yeah. So I'm hearing this deep commitment to going in as a listener and a learner, not as an expert or exporter of your ideas to the community. And And it's interesting that you said that it was about that you were there representing Northeastern, right? A university. And I think that speaks to like the power imbalance in these relationships, right? That it didn't matter so much that you were a woman of color, but you were a person representing a powerful institution and needed to come in with that humility and awareness of the legacy and the historical. It's not just Northeastern. Like I think in general, this is why that the expression town gown relationships not being so good is kind of taken as a given, because it's a dynamic that exists across the board in higher ed. Yeah. Sam, one last question, and then I'm going to switch to the other Sam and our friends from Millennium Campus Network. Was it that Lisa was putting in the time? What made you stick with it? Why did you not just walk away? And what was it? Because it was the two of you and others who were building some foundation right from the beginning that has lasted 18 years and will continue to evolve over time. What resonated with you in those early years? Oh, you're muted.
I would say Lisa, she's like family now, right? So over the course of our relationship, she's like family. And I also knew and understood the difficulty being a woman of color, representing an institution, and then at the same time being from the community. And Lisa could tell you, I've been one of her number one champions the entire time on both ends, institutional and community. And then the nature of the work. I grew up in Boston. I was a troubled youth. The school system failed me. My mother didn't have a college education, blah, 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 blah. And just knew that if I could work with others to really challenge the system, challenge the city, and look for ways to improve youth development. We've done, like Lisa said, racial profiling, civilian review. We've always looked at youth issues, employment issues. So it's been just trying to be a value to community. And then I seen Lisa as community, so I had to support her on both ends.
Right.
And Rebecca, just to try to chime in on that, one of the things that I heard from Sam and in many of the conversations initially was that what they didn't want to see was for me to be in the community when I needed something. But what it meant is that I needed to be a part of the community when I didn't need something, which meant that I attended numerous community meetings. I sit on countless and numerous community boards. Their initiatives are important to us, and so we support them in that way, which is why when things come up on our end, it's not that I'm just picking up the phone at that time to say, this is what I need. We're in constant communication, whether I'm supporting what they have going on, and in turn, it's a reciprocal relationship.
Right. I was just about to say authenticity and reciprocity in the relationship, right? That it's not helicoptering in when we need something, but actually being there and showing up in real ways. Thank you both. Let's switch gears to what the principles look like, what these practices look like in an international context. And Sam Vega, I know you enough to know that you want these amazing fellows to do a lot of talking. But before they do, can you tee them up a little bit and give everybody a little bit more understanding of how important experiential and project-based learning is to your model, and why this notion of ethical community engagement really matters as a core principle for MCN? And then we'll turn things over to Mariana and Katarina to talk about how they may have grappled with these issues in their project in Sao Paulo.
Wonderful. Yeah, I want to turn it over to them as soon as possible. I'll be brief and just share that 9 years ago, we started to build our core curriculum. My colleague Abigail Ketchen had drawn on 30 different leadership curricula, but also her own experience serving in the Peace Corps in Moldova and in Jamaica. And she felt a lot of angst around that experience. What she terms Heropreneurship, going into a community thinking you're the savior, you're the hero, you have all the answers. And so really what she wanted to do through the Millennium Fellowship was to help students challenge their own core assumptions around why they're doing what they're doing and how they're engaging in community. So for us in our core curriculum, there are different simulation scenarios. A simple one I can just share: person A is helping person B. You know nothing else about either person, but give character traits of person A and character traits of person B. And what inevitably happens, we've done this hundreds of times with young leaders around the world. Well, person A is the giver, they're generous, they're benevolent, they're resourceful, all these positive attributes. Person B isn't as intelligent, doesn't have as many capabilities, competencies, more negative attributes. And then we say, well, let's think about that framework and how that's applied in international development over the last 6+ decades. And then ask students to reflect on how that actually manifests in some of their own work. And I think just challenging students to really be discerning about how they're going about this work is foundational. And students are at different stages. I mean, for a lot of them, this is their first time engaging in this type of work. But for many, they have 18 years, 20 years of history thinking this through, working on this, living this. And so it's just powerful that we've created a space where young leaders can come together and reflect together. And for me, Mariana and Katarina, the work they're doing with Colors of Care, I think is really emblematic of what is possible when students are discerning. So I'd love to turn it over to them to share a little bit more.
Yes, let's do that. And one thing I want to just say about Sam, and I think we're going to probably see this with Mariana and Katarina, is that the curriculum unpacks ways that we have been socialized to understand what leadership means, what expertise means. And in many ways, we uplift and value characteristics that we think of as leadership or entrepreneurship or helping and whatever it is, that are actually contradictory to some of the values of listening and learning and being empathetic that we're all talking about here tonight. And so I think unpacking that at an early age with our students is super valuable. So let's turn it over to Mariana and Katarina to tell us what you're doing with this work.
All right. So our project is called Colors of Care. And the idea is that we can educate healthcare professionals and also the general population in order to diminish racism in healthcare. As we talked about, as Lisa brought about, we have several implicit biases in our seeing of our patients. So as healthcare professionals, we do have that. And the outcomes, the health outcomes are generally worse for this population. As well as healthcare professionals. So me as a future healthcare professional in a few months, so I'll be graduating in a few months, and I have gone through experiences that made me feel like I was lesser than my other counterparts simply because of the color of my skin. And in one of these discussions, we decided to do something about this. And as students, when we choose to do things about this, we are all like, oh, let's do good. Right? That's what we all want. And our first instinct is exactly what we were talking about, is to simply give people something without necessarily knowing whether this is what they need, without necessarily wanting this is their priority and everything else. So me in the position of suffering racism in my situation, I also need to go to the communities and favelas here in Brazil and see if the patients, the people that we see, the other healthcare professionals, they feel the same way as I do, because they might not do. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the things that is very important. And I spoke to Sam a little bit about this today. This is why I think the first 3 principles are very important. So for us to actually look at the priorities of a community and actually acknowledge their own experience.
Mariana, thank you for sharing that and for sharing your experience in needing to check yourself and needing to check that impulse to go help. Can I ask, did you have some kind of moment of reckoning with yourself? Like, what inspired you to stop and take stock of what you were doing so you could change course there?
So, Rebecca, one of the things that you did right in the beginning of this presentation, right in the beginning of this conversation is, okay, so I need to deal with my privileges as well. So we just need to check that. It doesn't mean that we need to feel bad about it necessarily, but to recognize that our situation is different from the different situation of other people. And I think the only way that I got to understand that properly is by being surrounded by different people from different backgrounds. So by being immersed in that community. So how was I immersed in that community? So in life, so Brazil is a very unequal country everywhere. So we see that contrast. But also within the university context, we are put in within very underprivileged communities, and we're always interacting with people who come from different communities. So we start to notice what makes us similar and what differentiates us. Okay, so that is essential, and that is what made me stop and think, okay, this is important.
And thinking about how you're presenting, how you're showing up. And I hear you also saying celebrating both the similarities and the differences, right? This is not a situation in which we can, I always say that if we were truly empathetic, we couldn't bear it, right? But that we're learning, that's where perspective taking, right, is such an important part of it. And celebrating those differences as we keep going, because they're always going to be, I can't not be from Northeastern University. I can't not be from academia when I go into community, but we can work to mitigate the harms from those differences through more of this self-awareness. Katarina, let's hear from your perspective on this and how you engage with these questions. I'd also like to hear from you how you engage with them with each other, because you present as having different identities. I'm sure you have different lived experiences in the world. How do you negotiate that as a team, as well as negotiating the relationship you have with the communities you are working in?
Sure. We actually base a lot of our work in listening and discussing. So Mari is the one that inspired all of our group, as she already said. And we take very seriously, and as Mari said, the first 3 principles, I would even say the first 4 principles of your work really have steered our actions, even without us putting it down on paper. So we're a bunch of students. Mari is the only Black one. We're all white medicine students in a private college who have a series of biases and privileges that we may not even recognize. And so our first step within that meeting was to educate ourselves and talk to Mari, talk to the community. We have a great opportunity to talk with our community and have very close contact with them, and really just listen. I think if I have to take anything from this project, from all that we learned and all that we've done, is to listen. So most of our work is based on listening. We want to educate, of course, to make our change, but in order to do that, we have to actually understand and immerse ourselves in that community's reality, which is so different from ours. And so we are really trying to take the steps to avoid what happened to Sam W numerous times, and try to be mindful of the community that we're dealing with. And oops, my headphone just fell off, sorry. And what they need, if they need anything from us, and how we can do that in the best way possible. Because I think we have, we really want, and that actually, that's in our Millennium Fellowship course that we take. We want to help more often than we want to be helpful. And we really should focus on the second one with our actions and our intentions.
This notion of first do no harm, before we can even presume to do good, I think is a really important theme. I'm curious because I think the notion of accountability is at the core of all of this. Otherwise, it's just pretty language. And I think that the harm that comes from performative language is just another adding insult to injury if we're not delivering on this. And so as you, and I'm going to open this to everybody, and I'd love it if you ask questions of each other as well. How do we go from an understanding of these ideas to action items or agreements or whatever they might be that are negotiable and co-created, where we can hold ourselves accountable? Again, not with the notion that any of us get this perfect, right? But that if we don't name what better looks like, we're not going to be able to get there. We're not going to be able to course correct when we're not getting there. Anybody want to take a stab at sharing your thoughts about accountability?
I may try to start here.
Yeah.
I think that in a smaller scale, so we're talking about student projects at the moment. So in a smaller scale, we can try to include more people. So if we want to be anti-oppressive, so let's try to add people to the project who are more the people who are generally oppressed, right? We cannot expect harm to always be averted. We cannot expect us to be perfect, as you mentioned, but we can improve little by little. And I think the key to all of this is communication amongst ourselves. So if we're able to have this on paper as the principals are doing, so we know what we want to follow, we have it on paper, and we actually can go back little by little from time to time and see, okay, are we doing this? It's as simple as that. So just meeting with the people who are with you and saying, are we doing this? Are we doing this? Are we doing this? And we don't have to do all of these things at once. I think we need to be, as the last principle says as well, we need to be patient with ourselves, right? We don't need to do all together. We can have the best intents and not be able to do it, but try to have goals, try to have aims from time to time that we can try to fulfill.
Lisa and Sam W., what does accountability look like in your relationship?
In the community, the IRJ relationship, honestly, I would say there's still a level of imbalance. The power has been imbalanced from the very beginning, community, institution, like that's what I'm saying. We've done amazing work. But when you're talking about institutions which operate, they have their mission, vision, and then you have, and our board is a makeup of, 8, 9, 10, 12 community-based organizations. It's, I would say it's our next level of work. But I think what's key is, and foundation is, and you mentioned earlier, is, one, I would call it collaborative visioning and intention at the beginning, right? So that intentions are across the board. And then the sustainable relationships. And I think what has been probably the most powerful thing for the IRJ board, because of the longevity of the relationship, it has been process oriented, right? And so we have a long way to go, but I don't know of any other community-based community board in the city of Boston that's been together as long as we've been. Like, I'm saying seriously, we have at least 7 to 8 people that's been involved over 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, Sam, this attentiveness to process, it is something, and this is where the patience comes in. And Lisa, I'd love for you to talk about that process and maybe give us an example of when you have changed course because of something you heard from the community board or started to do things better, because process takes time. And time means these things take longer and cost more and are harder to do than we want, with our sense of urgency and with our sense of grant deadlines or semester deadlines or whatever. But process should trump the speed of, we're doing this work at the speed of trust.
Hey, Lisa, an example I think was the the civilian review work?
I completely agree with Sam. I think one of the concrete examples that, and I'll just throw out, is in the civilian review work. So I think the biggest piece of what took place there is there were several community members on our board who and in the community that were complaining about the complaint process altogether. The fact that for a community member to file a complaint, they have to go into a law enforcement department, which is already systemically imbalanced, and people do not feel comfortable going into a law enforcement department to file a complaint. So one of the issues that were raised from our community advisory board and members of the community was that if there could be pilot sites within the community where community members were trained to help community residents file complaints at their local agencies. And those agencies would be entities that could take the complaints and then proceed on behalf of filing them with the department. So as a result of that, our community advisory board was selected as a board of agencies that went through a training. They were certified, and each of their agencies were able to represent facilitating that process in coming into play. So I think, as Mariana said earlier, it's not about being perfect. We're never gonna get it perfectly. We have a lot of that's why Sam is laughing. We have a lot of conversations where we could be in the middle of a project, or we could be in the middle of a process, and there's some very uncomfortable conversations that arise. I think it's being able to create a space for those conversations to take place and to be able to say, okay, let's look at this differently. What can we do differently to make this feel better so that we can move forward? I think having shared visions and shared goals, we try to prioritize that in our meetings and in our conversations. Just kind of, not that we create the goals and we come and we create the agendas and we sit down in the meetings. Sam as a co-director and Madre Good, who's not with us as a co-director, we meet separately. We come up with the agendas together. We prioritize what our goals are for the year. And I think that it's the leadership of IRJ, Jack McDevitt, Amy Peril, Carlos Cuevas, myself, the leadership of the board and the board members being committed to the process that helps make it work. And that's what I would say accountability looks like in the work that we do.
Can I just say one thing real quick? And I always push for multiple year goals. Like, not just 1 year, 2 year, let's try 3 years, let's try 5 years. And then we can hold each other accountable for a long period of time, longer period of time.
Thank you all for modeling this work and for living apart from the idea that we tried to capture these principles in writing. You live them. And it's work like that that really inspires them. And that's what we're trying to articulate and share. Ted, we just have a minute or two left. I want to hand this back to you for your thoughts and reflections.
Well, let me start by saying that I've just come out of a Boston planning meeting where the university itself reflected what it had learned from the community. As I think a number of folks know, this past year, the university accepted 900 more students than it normally would have accepted. And that was partly because of uncertainties around COVID and international travel and a range of other things. And many of those students ended up living in local hotels, but a lot of them ended up living in adjacent communities and having what many community people saw as a very negative impact on those local communities. And when the university revealed some of these impacts and numbers to the community at a meeting back in October, there was a level of shock within the community and within our own university community, and a lot of pushback against that. So the plan that the university presented to the community tonight calls for changing the configuration of our dormitories to turn some singles into doubles and some doubles into triples, I guess, and What was particularly interesting about tonight's meeting is that the community representatives, which included a lot of current and recent students, looked at the plan and decided that the university had actually learned something from the meeting in October, and that the university's response, which is to reduce the number of students who will be admitted this fall and to make other kinds of changes, reflects what some community people saw as a new attitude on the part of the community that reflects a greater inclination to co-create with the community and to do so in a way that might actually provide some benefits to the community. So the business of how we as individuals or faculty or researchers or staff enter into our relationships with communities is also something that can be reflected by institutions. It's often in that institutional relationship with communities that we lose sight of the need for ethical approaches and ethical engagement. And so I would say that both on an individual level and on an institutional level, the subjects that we're going to be discussing over the balance of this semester should be highly informative for us as individuals and for the work we do within institutions. And what I've done is to post within the chat the connection so that those of you who want to see how the university presented this new plan to the community can see that. And if you can't access this through the connection in the chat, the entire meeting will be posted on the Boston Planning and Development Agency website as of tomorrow morning. So I think we have a lot to learn, but also a lot to see in terms of how a co-creation and shared engagement can actually bring about positive change.
Absolutely. And it's something that we didn't get a chance to talk about tonight, but in my experience, I think many of us would share this, that the ethical is also the strategic. When we go forward together from the beginning, we get farther and we avoid so many, not just of the harms, but of the strategic obstacles that keep us from reaching our shared aims. So many, many thanks to all of you. Lisa, both Sams, Katarina, Mariana, what a joy to be with you. Thanks also to the folks, Hami and Kwai, who were providing such great technical support tonight. And Ted, as always, we want to encourage you to come back next week. We will be working with or discussing with one of our new colleagues at Northeastern, Dr. Kimberly Lucas, and looking at the power of developing policy for early childhood education with people who have actually been early childhood educators and bring that wisdom to the work. So please come back next week and we'll keep this conversation going all semester. Thank you all so very much.